Bismillah. Good afternoon. This is my first time at Greenbelt, and I was remembering, I was thinking back to the last time that I was at a festival, and I think it was 1971. I went to see the Grateful Dead in Bickershaw in the north of England, and it poured with rain. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember an awful lot about it, but it was a great time. But I honestly, coming here, is it's an honor for me to be here with all of you and to feel, this incredible warmth and a very welcoming spirit here that I really appreciate and feel very at home with. I want to take you on a musical journey. This is a journey that I am taking. Music, I've been listening to music all my life, probably like most people. I grew up listening to my dad's music. Fortunately, he liked Fats Waller and Duke Ellington, as well as Gilbert and Sullivan. But as far as I'm concerned, it was all good. And, just kind of growing up, time in boarding school and all those things, music played a really important role. In the 60s in particular, and in the early 70s, I think a lot of us felt that music was something that could actually change the world. Although a lot of that music very quickly got commercialized and just changed a lot of people's lifestyles. But recently, I've been wanting to find my own musical roots. And while the music that I love and have always loved, and the music that I try and play, is kind of rooted in the blues, for me I wanted to kind of trace this back a little bit further. And I started reading different books on the subject. And there was a book by a German ethnomusicologist by the name of Gerhard Kubik, who wrote a book called Africa and the Blues. Discovered interesting things like the banjo is actually an African instrument, that then the black slaves met the white slaves from Ireland and Scotland, and that musical instrument made a transition from being actually African to being something that was kind of one of the core ingredients of bluegrass and Western country music. But there was a book that I read by a woman called Sylvia Diouf, and she recalls playing the adhan, the call to prayer that was recorded in Cairo, and she played that alongside a work song, which is the kind of pre-blues music of the enslaved Africans. And she said when she played it to the audience, it was like everyone in the room suddenly got it, like these things have the same root. And I was really interested by that, because I know the Egyptian adhan, and for me it's a little bit flowery and kind of over Middle Easternized, and very kind of becomes very formalized. But so I thought, well, I want to listen to some of the early music from the pre-blues music in America, but also I wanted to compare that with the spiritual music, the call to prayer and the recitation of Quran from West Africa, because approximately 30% of the slaves who came from Africa were Muslim. And that bit of history has basically vanished. There are one or two books that record the lives of some of the people, but we know that there were Muslims who were sold into slavery, or they were captured and ended up in slavery, and around 30% of those were Muslims who went into the Americas. And when the earliest recordings were probably around 1930 with people like Alan Lomax. But there are descriptions of a visitor who went to South Carolina in 1977 and talked about the plaintive African songs that they could hear. And someone else in 1853 recalling a field holler, the songs that the people would sing when they were working in the fields. He said, "Such a sound as I've never heard before in my life, a long, loud musical shout, rising and falling," which is really exactly what an adhan sounds like. So I started thinking about, that there's really a kind of, in Western music, there's always been a sort of spiritual thread throughout Western music. You think of even some of the famous rock songs, The Presence of the Lord, Stairway to Heaven, Soul of a Man, A Love Supreme by Coltrane, People Get Ready, and even good old All You Need Is Love. These are songs that have a kind of spiritual element in it. And various people have written about how modern Western music, whether it's hip hop, rock, psychedelic music, funk, Motown, it really has its roots in a kind of gospel, R&B, kind of soul that actually finds its way back into the blues. And the idea that the blues comes from Africa is fairly well recognized at this stage. But the contribution that the Muslims have made, I think, is something that I found very interesting to understand. So if we just follow the thing back, you take rock music, basically has its roots in the kind of electric blues of Memphis, Chicago, B.B. King, Elmore James, Muddy Waters, Howling Wolf. These are familiar names, Little Walter. Going back further into the acoustic music of the Delta with Skip James and Son House, Robert Johnson, Blind Willie McTell, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Charlie Patton, Willie Brown. And that this music was the music of the plantations. This is where people would sing in the fields, but also that early music was what they played in the speakeasies and the juke joints, where after a hard day's work, people would go and chill out, have a few drinks, and just, after a long day's work for very little pay. But somehow this music, while it was present as a very American music, didn't really, it was seen as kind of slave music. So it never really got popularized in the United States until it crossed the Atlantic and came to the UK and was then picked up by musicians like John Mayall and Eric Clapton and Peter Green, and these musicians who basically sent it, and the Rolling Stones, who sent this music back to the United States, where people suddenly realized, wow, this is actually our music. So this is actually an authentic folk music of the United States, but its origin is clearly in the Delta. So for the people of the Delta, this was a music of survival. This was like a poor man's survival music for the people who'd been displaced, and many of them are like almost cries of pain. And the Sufis say that the cry of a man in pain is actually one of the names of God. So, I want you to maybe slightly disconnect your brain and just let your ears connect with your heart and just listen to a few of these clips. This is when Soufiane Diouf played the Egyptian Adhan. This was the music that she played along with it for people to get a sense of. They're chopping trees. Those were the work songs. Before the work songs, these were the work songs and the hollers. Prior to them, they had music that was called moans. And this is all before the blues had appeared. These are the earliest recordings. And so you had, for example, moans that were like this.
Oh, Lord, I woke up this morning, man, I was feeling bad. Whoa, babe, I was feeling bad.
And before that, you had things like this.
Oh, Lord. Well, I wonder will I ever get back home. Hey, hey. Ooh, oh, Lord.
This is profound spiritual cry of a man who was yearning for union with his homeland or with his Lord. It's that idea of the human being in his separateness, wanting union with the things that are dear to him or the beings that are dear to him. And those people who sang that music come from this culture.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allah
الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Musically, this is basically exactly the same. What the German ethnomusicologists noticed was the minor pentatonic actually comes from Africa, and the singing, the call and response kind of singing that you get, and what they call melisma, the idea of one syllable that is extended across many notes, is common in the adhan, in the call to prayer, and it's also absolutely common in the early moans and the hollers that preceded American blues music. And to give you just a few more examples here of recitation of Quran, melodically the same as you hear with the field hollers. This is reciting Quran in Africa. And again.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي أنزل على عبده الكتاب ولم يجعل له عوجا قيما لينذر بأسا شديدا من لدنه ويبشر المؤمنين.
It's not so different. So there were probably a century at least where there was no recording. This is how they still, the Quran reciting is still how they recite in West Africa.
Well, I wonder will I ever.
But we don't have recordings in America any earlier than this kind of thing, like what they call Tangalai blues. But I think the link is there if you listen melodically, and the means of expression, very, very, very similar. And I'm going to leave you with one of the most astounding calls to prayer I've ever heard in my life from Touba in Senegal. I mean, if that doesn't make your hair stand on end. So for me, this was a kind of, it was an interesting confirmation that the idea of the blues connects to Africa, but then what kind of Africa? Who are the people in Africa? So it seemed to me that, today, we look at Islam as if it's a kind of foreign religion, comes from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent. It doesn't does it fit here? It feels a kind of strange thing, particularly now, where it's incredibly kind of politicized. But if we think closer to home, Islam is also the religion of Africa, West Africa, North Africa, East Africa, South Africa. If a third of these men of the enslaved Africans were Muslim, they were deported to the Americas and the West Indies, many of them were educated, they were literate, they were knowledgeable, they read and wrote Quran, they recited it, they sang spiritual songs. And the essence of their devotional singing and their call to prayer formed the melodic basis for the popular music of the Delta. And that in turn became a major taproot of all Western popular music. So, while on the one hand we may see Islam as a foreign thing, I think if we just let our ears talk to us a little bit when we listen to these things, we can hear that the musical contribution of the West African Muslims is so deeply rooted in our transatlantic cultural DNA that we don't even recognize it as a foreign thing. We all feel comfortable with the kind of blues, R&B, with that whole musical genre. We feel like it belongs to us. We're comfortable in it. We're at home with it. We love it. And for me, it made me think. And so I would just ask you, maybe while you're drinking your coffee, that if you're listening to the blues, just think a little bit about where it also may be coming from and what it contains. Thank you.